Three times in March of 2026, every light in Cuba went dark. Not a neighborhood, not a city, the entire country. 10 million people, no power, no refrigeration, hospitals running on nothing. And this time, nobody's coming to turn the lights back on. Cuba isn't just having a bad month, it's running out of everything. Fuel, food, medicine, people. And what's happening right now on this island 90 miles from Florida may be the final chapter of one of the longest-running communist experiments in history. Let's break it down. Right now, as you're watching this, most Cubans are living through 16 or more hours of darkness every single day. And that's on a good day, when the grid doesn't collapse entirely. In March alone, the national power grid failed 3 separate times. March 4th, March 16th, March 21st. Each time, the entire island went black. Over 10 million people plunged into total darkness. No lights, no fans in the tropical heat, no water, because the pumps are electric. No cell service, nothing. After the March 16th blackout, it took 29 hours just to reconnect the grid. 29 hours of a country just sitting still. People navigated Havana's streets with phone flashlights and torches. In the old tourist quarter, a few restaurants kept open on generators while musicians played in the dark. Everyone else just waited. Cuba's president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, admitted on national television that the island hasn't received a single oil shipment in 3 months. Not one tanker, not one barrel. Since January 9th of 2026, nothing. Cuba produces roughly 40% of the fuel that it needs to function. The rest has to come from somewhere else. And right now, nowhere is sending it. The Antonio Guterres power plant, a decades-old Soviet-era behemoth and the backbone of Cuba's entire electrical grid, keeps tripping offline. Every time it does, it triggers a cascading failure that drags down the whole system. One plant fails, and load shifts to others. Those plants can't handle it, and they fail too. Within minutes, the entire island goes dark. At its worst, Cuba had less than 590 megawatts online. The country needs over 2,000 just to meet basic demand. That's not a gap, that's a cliff. And the effects aren't abstract. When the power goes, the water pumps stop. Nearly 1 million Cubans depend on electric pumps for drinking water. When the power goes, refrigeration dies. Food spoils within hours in the Caribbean heat. When the power goes, hospitals go dark. Surgeries get postponed. Tens of thousands of them, according to Díaz-Canel himself. Fuel prices on the black market have hit $9 a liter. To fill up a car costs more than $300, more than most Cubans earn in an entire year. But here's the thing about Cuba's crisis. It didn't start with a single blackout or a single missed shipment. It started with something quieter, something that most people didn't notice until it was already too late. The shortages became normal. At first, blackouts felt temporary, annoying but manageable. People would adjust. They charged phones during brief windows of electricity. They'd fill buckets with water when the pumps would run. They cooked outdoors with charcoal and firewood because electric stoves were useless. Families pooled whatever food they could find and ate communally, racing to prepare meals before the power cut again. One woman in Havana, Suliedi Crespo, told reporters that her refrigerator broke from the voltage surges. She's got 2 small children. If there's no electricity tomorrow, she said, we won't be able to get water. Another resident described giving away part of a pot of soup while it was still fresh because without power, it would just rot within hours. Cooking with coal has become so common that asthmatic Cubans are getting sicker from the smoke. Cuba's ration card, the libreta, was supposed to guarantee basic goods. It's been the backbone of the state's social contract since 1962. But by mid-2025, deliveries were arriving months late, and when they came at all, the contents were barely worth collecting. 2 pounds of brown sugar, 1 pound of peas, a packet of salt per person for the month. Cubans have largely given up on the libreta and have turned to the informal market instead, if they have the money, which, again, most don't. An independent food security report found that 1 in 4 Cubans now goes to bed hungry. 29% eat only twice a day. 4% manage just 1 meal. And here's a quietly devastating number. 97% of Cubans surveyed said they'd lost access to food that they could previously afford, purely because of inflation and collapsing purchasing power. When asked who's responsible, 64% blamed the Cuban government and its mismanagement. Only 8% pointed to the U.S. embargo. The gap between the government's narrative and its people's reality has never been wider. This isn't panic, it's resignation. It's the people reorganizing their entire lives around scarcity. Not because they think things will get better, but because they've accepted that this is just how it is now.
And that's where the real danger begins. Because behind the daily survival, behind the buckets and the firewood and the empty refrigerators, Cuba's actual infrastructure is disintegrating.
The power plants that keep failing aren't just old, they're ancient. Most of them were built during the Soviet era, designed for operational lifespans of around 100,000 hours. They've run far beyond that. Some have been operating for over 40 years with minimal maintenance. Spare parts don't exist. The machinery to make spare parts doesn't exist. And the fuel to run these plants, even if they did work perfectly, it isn't coming. Cuba tried to pivot. The government invested over $1 billion in solar parks, 34 of them synchronized with the grid by early 2026, producing about 560 megawatts at peak. The original plan called for 55 parks by end of 2025. They didn't get there, and even what they've built has a fundamental problem. Solar helps during the day, but residential demands peak at night. Without massive battery storage, which Cuba can't afford, solar doesn't prevent the cascading grid failures that happen when a major thermal plant trips offline after dark. The government estimates that a full energy transition would require $8 to $10 billion over the next decade. Cuba doesn't have $8 to $10 billion. It barely has 8 to 10 days of fuel. And it's not just the grid. In Havana, only 44 of the city's 106 garbage trucks are still running. Refuse is piling up on street corners. The smell is getting worse. Airlines have slashed flights to the island because there's no jet fuel to refuel the planes. Tourism, once Cuba's economic lifeline, is collapsing. Nobody's booking a vacation to a country with no electricity. Now, the system does still technically exist, but it's held together with hope and habit, not infrastructure. And that brings us to the question at the center of everything. What keeps a system alive? The answer for Cuba has always been the same: oil. Now, Cuba has never been self-sufficient. Not under Batista, not under Castro, not now. The country's entire modern economy was built on imported fuel. For decades, the Soviet Union provided it. Cheap oil, subsidized trade, favorable credit. Soviet oil ran Cuba's power plants and factories at discount prices. In return, the USSR got a communist ally parked 90 miles from Miami and a missile base that nearly started World War III. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Cuba lost roughly $6 billion a year in support overnight. GDP crashed by over 30%. The country entered what the government euphemistically called the special period, a nightmare of starvation, rationing, and societal near collapse. Public transport reverted to horse-drawn carts and imported Chinese bicycles. Malnutrition surged. People lost weight so fast that doctors coined a term for it. Cuba legalized the US dollar and opened its doors to tourism just to survive. Cuba survived that crisis, barely, because Venezuela stepped in. Under Hugo Chavez and then Nicolas Maduro, Venezuela sent Cuba around 100,000 barrels of oil per day at deeply subsidized rates. In exchange, Cuba sent doctors, tens of thousands of them, to work in Venezuelan clinics. It was a lifeline that kept the lights on for nearly 2 decades. But that lifeline just got severed completely. In January of 2026, U.S. Special Forces carried out a military operation that removed Maduro from power in Venezuela. It was the most dramatic American military intervention in Latin America in decades, and its shockwave hit Cuba immediately. Venezuelan oil to Cuba stopped almost overnight. And then Trump went further. On January 29th, he signed an executive order threatening tariffs on any country that sells oil directly or indirectly to Cuba. Mexico, which had briefly stepped in as a supplier, cut its shipments from roughly 18,800 barrels per day to about 5,000 under U.S. pressure. Then, those slowed to a trickle too. A system doesn't fail when things go wrong. It fails when it can't keep things going. And Cuba just lost the one thing that kept it going for 60 years. Hey, if you're following this breakdown, be sure to subscribe to Fall of Nations, because what happens next is how shortages start turning into something much bigger. Now, here's where Cuba's crisis turns from bad to irreversible. No fuel means no electricity. No electricity means no refrigeration. No refrigeration means food rots in warehouses, in homes, in the fields. No fuel means no trucks. No trucks means crops that could feed people never make it from farms to markets. Farmers in eastern Cuba describe fields ready for harvest with no diesel to bring the crops in. Others showed broken machinery that they have no way to repair. No fuel means no irrigation pumps. No irrigation means less food gets grown in the first place. Less food means more imports are needed. But Cuba has no foreign currency to pay for imports, so the shelves, they stay empty. Prices keep climbing, and the cycle feeds itself. This is the feedback loop, and once it starts, it accelerates. Now look at the numbers. Cumulative inflation since Cuba's 2021 monetary reform has exceeded 220%. The government claims inflation was just 14% in 2025, but independent economists put the real figure closer to 70%. The average state salary is about 6,500 Cuban pesos per month, which at the informal exchange rate comes to about $13. A carton of 30 eggs costs over 3,000 pesos. That's half a month's wages for eggs. Pensioners earning about 4,000 pesos can afford roughly 3 days' worth of basic food per month after the government's most recent pension increase. Now, over 80% of the food that Cuba consumes is imported. Domestic rice production covers less than 11% of annual demand. The economy contracted by 4% in just the first 9 months of 2025. And now, with no fuel flowing, the contraction is accelerating. The system isn't just struggling, it's feeding its own decline. Every shortage creates another shortage. Every failure compounds the last, and there's no circuit breaker. So, what do people do when the system can't sustain them anymore? Well, they leave. Since 2021, over 1 million Cubans have left the island. Let that number sink in. Over 1 million people, from a country of roughly 11 million. Some estimates put Cuba's effective population as low as 8.6 million now, a level that the island hasn't seen since the mid-1980s. The Economist estimates the drop from over 11 million to under 9 million. Either way, this is the largest exodus in Cuba's history. Bigger than the Mariel boat lift. Bigger than the rafter crisis of 1994. Bigger than the wave that followed Castro's revolution. And it's not just the volume, it's who's leaving. 80% of recent immigrants are working-age adults between 15 and 59. Doctors, engineers, nurses, teachers. The people that Cuba needs most are the ones that are walking out the door. Most head to the United States through Central America, until Nicaragua shut down the visa-free transit in early 2026. Others went to Spain, Brazil, Mexico. The Cuban government has largely stopped trying to prevent it. Immigration has become a pressure valve to let the unhappy ones go, and maybe the rest won't revolt. In 2024, Cuba recorded 71,000 births and 130,000 deaths, nearly twice as many people dying as being born. The median age has climbed to 42.5 years, the highest in the Americas. Cuba is now the most aged country in Latin America and the Caribbean. Entire villages in the countryside have been depopulated. Farms can't find workers. Schools can't find teachers. Hospitals can't find nurses, which is bitterly ironic for a country that once exported medical professionals to the world. The government knows exactly what's happening. In 2024, Cuba's own statistics agency admitted that the island had lost over 10% of its effective population since December of 2020. They've postponed a national census, originally scheduled for 2022, and then 2024, and then 2025, and now pushed to 2026, reportedly because the results would be too embarrassing to publish. One official blamed external aggressions and internal problems, which translation means the numbers are devastating and they know it. This isn't just a migration crisis, though. It's demographic collapse in real time. A country bleeding out its future, one departure at a time. The government knows the legitimacy problem that this creates. Cuba's entire social contract, the deal the revolution made with its people, was simple. Give up political freedom, and we'll give you healthcare, education, and stability. For decades, it worked well enough. Cuba achieved near universal literacy. Its healthcare system was the envy of the developing world. Infant mortality rates were lower than in the United States. But you can't eat a literacy rate. You can't power a hospital with a diploma. In July of 2021, the frustration boiled over into the largest protests that Cuba had seen since 1959. Thousands took to the streets across the country, shouting "Libertad" and demanding change. The government cracked down hard. Hundreds were arrested, teenagers sentenced to years in prison. But the underlying anger never went away. It just found a different outlet, the door. And while Cuba empties from within, the pressure from outside is only getting worse. Donald Trump has made Cuba a personal project. He's called it a failing nation. He said he'll have, quote, the honor of taking Cuba. he's floated a, quote, friendly takeover. He told reporters in March, "Whether I free it, take it, I think I could do anything I want with it." Now, after the U.S. military operation that removed Maduro from Venezuela in January, Trump turned his attention south and made it clear: Cuba is next. Secretary of State Marco Rubio, himself the son of Cuban immigrants and one of the most hawkish voices on Cuba in American politics, is reportedly leading negotiations, including direct talks with Raul Castro's grandson, who some in Washington see as more pragmatic than the current leadership. Diaz-Canel confirmed in a televised address on March 13th that Cuban and U.S. officials had been meeting, but warned that Cuba would not negotiate over its political system. Rubio's response was blunt: "The changes Cuba has offered so far are not dramatic enough." Trump's response was even blunter. At an investment summit in Miami on March 29th, while talking about the U.S. operation in Venezuela, he added, "And Cuba's next, by the way, but pretend I didn't say that." The strategy is clear: starve the regime of fuel, wait for the economy to buckle, and then present an offer that Cuba can't refuse. The executive order that Trump signed on January 29th doesn't just block Venezuelan oil. It threatens tariffs on any nation that ships fuel to Cuba. That's not a sanctions policy, that's a siege. Some analysts compare it to the endgame that toppled Eastern European communist regimes in the early 1990s. Others warn that it could trigger a humanitarian catastrophe or push Cuba into the arms of China or Russia. On March 30th, a single Russian oil tanker arrived in Havana carrying 100,000 tons of crude, enough to produce roughly 250,000 barrels of diesel, enough to cover Cuba's energy needs for about 12 and a half days. 12 days. That's the lifeline. That's all there is. Some analysts saw the Russian delivery as a signal that Washington may be showing slight flexibility. Others saw it as Moscow testing how far that it can push before Trump retaliates. The UN has warned of immediate humanitarian collapse. Human rights experts have called the blockade an extreme form of unilateral economic coercion that violates international law. The United States wants regime change by the end of the year, and Cuba is caught between surrender and starvation. So where does this end? Well, Cuba's government once drew up something called Option Zero, an emergency plan for total self-sufficiency. No fuel, no foreign aid, draconian rationing, organic farming by necessity, not choice. Horses instead of tractors, oxen instead of trucks, pre-industrial living standards for 11 million people. It was drafted in the 1990s during the special period, and most scholars believe that it was never fully implemented because some trickle of fuel always arrives just in time from Venezuela, from Mexico, from sympathetic allies that are willing to defy Washington. In 2026, that trickle has stopped. There's no Soviet patron coming back. Venezuela is gone. Its own government replaced in a U.S. military operation. Mexico is backing off under threat of American tariffs. The workforce is aging and shrinking. Foreign investment is non-existent. Who's putting money into a country with no electricity? The infrastructure is decades past its expiration date. And the one thing that held it all together, cheap subsidized oil, has been cut off by the most powerful country on earth, sitting just 90 miles away, actively demanding regime change. Cuba isn't facing a crisis it can recover from with a good year or a lucky deal. The structural foundations, energy, demographics, agriculture, currency, are all failing simultaneously. This isn't one domino falling, it's every domino all at once in slow motion. The only thing keeping millions of Cuban families alive right now is money from abroad. Remittances, cash sent by Cubans who have already left, sustain an estimated 70% of households. About 90% of those remittances come from the U.S. Washington currently limits formal transfers to $1,200 per year. Some in Congress want to ban remittances entirely. If that were to happen, Cuba's last economic lifeline would disappear too. Collapse doesn't always happen in a single moment. Sometimes it happens as a country slowly runs out of what it needs to keep going. The lights flicker, the shelves empty, the young leave, the old remain. And one day, the system that held everything together simply isn't there anymore. That's what we're watching in Cuba right now. So what do you think? Will Cuba negotiate its way out, or is this the final chapter of 60 years of revolution? And if the regime falls, what happens to the millions that are still on the island? Let us know in the comments, and while you're there, subscribe to Fall of Nations for more.